Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I'd like to start by thanking and acknowledging the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you join the community, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Charlotte McCrory to the show to chat about Katherine of Aragon's tomb at Peterborough Cathedral. Charlotte is currently undertaking a PhD investigating the tombs of royal women 1437 to 1557 and how to project dynastic and personal memory. She completed an undergraduate degree in history at the University of Kent, as well as doing an MA in museum studies at the University of Leicester. Charlotte has been fascinated by history since she was 3 years old, and the Tudors have always remained her passion. Outside of history, she currently works as a school librarian, bakes a lot, and is a proud Studio Players member, an amateur dramatic musical theatre group in Ilkeston. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Charlotte. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Natalie?
I'm well, thank you. We've had a lovely sunny day here in Sydney after a few grey days, so I'm really happy with that.
Yes, it's a bit dreary and drizzly here.
Is it? Yes, of course. So please introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Yes, so I'm Charlotte McCrory and I'm currently a second year PhD student with the University of Winchester. I've always loved history and the Tudors especially, and I just really wanted to kind of get into looking at like tombs since I did a second year module at university which looked at the art of death, and I just found it so interesting. And I thought, oh, what if you kind of combine this idea of like tombs and what tombs are with the idea of queenship and what queenship is? And that's kind of how my thesis was born, really. But I currently work as a librarian in a secondary school, and I've got a background in museums and archives as well. So bit of an all-round person.
Fabulous. Sounds wonderful. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your PhD project. We will be talking about one aspect of it today. So before we do that, tell us a little bit more about it.
Yes, so the very long title of my PhD project is looking at the tombscapes of royal women from 1437 to 1557 and how they impact dynastic and personal memory. And what's unique about my project is that I'm looking at tombscapes over a longer period of time. So I'm not just looking at when they were created and stopping there. I'm going right up to the modern day and seeing how these tombscapes have evolved and changed based upon the needs of different centuries and different communities. So I start with Joan of Navarre and Katherine of Aragon all the way back in 1437. And the last person that I finish looking at is Anne of Cleves, who died in 1557. So I've got a very broad range that covers all of the Lancastrians, all of the Yorkists and the Tudor Queen consorts, including Margaret Beaufort and Cecily Neville. So that's why I use the phrase royal women, because you can't ignore those.
Fabulous. Thank you. And so today we're actually going to be focusing on the tomb of Katherine of Aragon. So before we do that, it would be wonderful if you could just give us a little bit of context. So what were the key events leading up to Katherine's death?
Yes. So as I'm sure most of your listeners know, the divorce between Catherine and Henry and the love triangle with Anne Boleyn is a very commonly known story. But essentially what this boils down to was Catherine was put aside. She was divorced and claimed that she had actually never been married to Henry. She had always been the widow of Prince Arthur. During the 1530s, she was gradually edged further and further out of court until she ended up in Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire. And there was in the court basically a split between two sides. So those who supported Catherine and those who followers of the Boleyns. And I kind of pick up Catherine's story right at the end at Kimbolton. But what I found really interesting, she was allowed visitors, but it was quite a trek from the centre of London, the court, to Kimbolton at the time. So there was a feeling that they were trying to isolate her somewhat just before she died.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, Catherine was a much loved figure and very popular still at court. So how did the general public react when they discovered that, in fact, Catherine had died?
There was actually some mixed reactions. So a lot of the general public, as you said, absolutely adored Catherine. They saw her as the rightful queen and they mourned her. So when she was actually progressing up to Kimbolton and through the north, she still tried to continue doing queenly duties, which annoyed Henry at court. The general public were quite saddened by this. And obviously those who supported Catherine in the court were also saddened by this. However, those on the kind of the Boleyn side of things, or the opposite side of Catherine, were really actually overjoyed by it. Accounts of Henry and Anne dressing up in yellow, and then Henry holding up Elizabeth and proclaiming her as a legitimate daughter, and this idea that this sense of weight has been lifted off of that side. So you really do see the split between the supporters and those who were supporters of the new regime with Catherine's death.
Yeah, absolutely. And so where was Catherine buried and what say did she have in this burial place?
Catherine was buried in the north aisle of Peterborough Cathedral, but at the time it was a Benedictine monastery, so it wasn't a cathedral at all. It was only granted cathedral status in 1539 during the dissolution of the monasteries. Peterborough had been known and had been a Benedictine monastery for quite some time, and it had been very well known for its productions of manuscripts and books. But by the kind of 15th century, the mid-15th century, it's noted in charter rolls that it had become quite impoverished, and they use the phrase oppressed as well. So I don't think it was one of the high-ranking monasteries in England. And there's no real strong connection between the royal family and Peterborough before then. Margaret Beaufort had owned lands in and around the area, but there's no direct evidence to show that she influenced the abbey in any way. Now, abbeys are not necessarily inferior to cathedrals. So it's not saying that straight away, oh, she's buried in an inferior place. It's still a religious place. And a lot of previous medieval queens were buried in monasteries such as Blackfriars monasteries in London. So you get Isabella of France, Edward II's wife. And essentially what happens, there's a bit of confusion as to whether Catherine left a will. And some sources say that she did leave a will. And there is a kind of will-like document in which it does say that she would like to be buried in the Observant Friars, the Order of St. Francis, so the Observant Franciscans. This was a religious order founded by St. Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, and it had very, very, very strong links with the Spanish royal family. In the 13th and 14th centuries, it was actually very common for female members of the Spanish royal family to give considerable patronage to this order. Ironically, the Order of St. Francis was also a church in which Henry and Catherine got married in 1509. There's a kind of personal link there for Catherine. But by 1536, the order had been dissolved, essentially, in England. So there wasn't really an order for her to be buried in. So looking at why she was buried in Peterborough, it's a bit of a mystery. There's no clear-cut answer, and there's nothing concrete in the sources that goes, yes, this is why she was buried there. I believe that it was personally down to two things. One is convenience. It's quite close to Kimbolton. And the second reason that I think they chose Peterborough is, again, this idea of isolating her. So we mentioned earlier about how she was moved away to Kimbolton and trying to kind of isolate her from the court and kind of not pretend she doesn't exist, but eliminate her influence. And I think this is what we see again with her being buried in Peterborough. It's an honourable place for a queen to be buried, but it is out of the way enough so that it doesn't necessarily become a site or a shrine for those who disagree with Henry's current policy of promoting Anne Boleyn. Now, I know within Peterborough itself, Mr. Eustace Chapuis, my favourite person, he does have quite a few vents in his letters, but interestingly, they're not about Peterborough as a location, and quite a lot of people just don't say anything about Peterborough being either a good place or a bad place for Catherine to be buried. So I think that lack of just comment on Peterborough kind of shows that it was an all right place. It was regarded as a quite a noble status place to be buried. What Chapuis does kind of have a vent about is the actual location within Peterborough Abbey at the time. Now, I have been able to show that Chapuis is actually false in his information. So he bemoans the idea, saying that she was buried so far away from the altar it wasn't even fit for the status of a baroness. So that tells us that there's an idea of hierarchy of where people of status would be buried within a church. But Catherine's tomb has always been right next to the high altar. As far as I can see, it's never been moved, and it's always been in one of the most sacred parts of the church. So therefore, I think Chapuis is getting kind of secondhand information. He even admits himself he gets secondhand information. And I think another thing that Chapuis could be doing is kind of hyping up the outrage, if you like, this idea of dishonouring Catherine in her memory and her burial in order to try and drum up support. Yes, so I find that when we talk about location in terms of Peterborough, it's interesting to look at not just a geographical location, but also the institutional location. Whereabouts in the abbey is she buried?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think Chapuis also was whining about the fact, of course, that she's buried as Princess Dowager, not as Queen of England. So he took issue absolutely with that, as did Catherine's daughter, of course, Mary, which is completely understandable, of course. So just before we talk more about what we know about the original tomb and monument, were there any other royal people buried at Peterborough or even after Catherine?
At the time of Catherine's burial, there was no other royal or noble members buried in Peterborough Cathedral. What you get in 1587 is you get Mary Queen of Scots being buried there after she was beheaded in Fotheringay Castle. And I think with those two women both buried in Peterborough, you could argue that there's this element of, they're in disgrace and they're quite far away and removed. Definitely within my thesis, Peterborough is one of the furthest, if not the furthest location I look at from London. So again, we go back to that idea of kind of isolating. And I think when you look back from like the mid 16th century and you see that there's no other royal personage there in Peterborough Cathedral or Peterborough Abbey, you then start to understand why Mary I actually wanted to move her mother. So in Mary's will, she does stipulate that after a short time, Queen Catherine would be removed, brought and laid near the place of my sepulture. So Mary had been planned to be buried in Westminster Abbey. So the idea of moving her mother to Westminster Abbey, it kind of legitimizes her title of queen and almost brings her back into the royal fold, which I think is really interesting. So I think at the time, with nobody kind of complaining about Peterborough, I think it may have been something to do with this idea of, for the Henrician state, she's buried as a Princess Dowager. That is the status that she's going. Therefore, Peterborough is a suitable location for her. However, under Mary, there's no other royal connection. She's very much isolated. So moving her mother's tomb not only legitimizes her mother and her father's marriage, and therefore her claim to the throne, but it also legitimizes Catherine's status as a queen. So I think you get quite a lot of an idea about status with Catherine and whether she was a Princess Dowager or whether she was a queen. And I think that's reflected in other royal personages that are buried there.
In your research, Charlotte, did you find out anything about what the original tomb and monument was like and who designed it, for example?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a treasure hunt. I found some evidence of what it might have looked like. So in Henry VIII's 1519 will, there he kind of describes and writes down or detailed information about what he wants as for a joint tomb with himself and Catherine. And this is the first evidence of a tomb for Katherine of Aragon we have. From what we can see, it's going to be fairly similar in nature to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's tomb in Westminster Abbey. In fact, that tomb is directly referenced, and they're even getting the same architect, Peter Torrigiano, to come over and do the same tomb. There isn't a specific location mentioned, but I think at the time Henry was imagining this massive, vast, great big tomb. And you got to remember at that time, Westminster was already very, very crowded. So he could have perhaps been thinking about St. George's Chapel earlier on. That tomb was meant to be made out of a kind of black and white marble. And as I said, looking very kind of regal and very similar to that of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But obviously that tomb never came about, unfortunately, because of the events that happened in the 1520s and 1530s. Looking back on the 1536 tomb and what we have, there's several sources that refer to Catherine's funeral. And all of these sources refer to Catherine's funeral as being this very big, lavish affair. And there is loads of heraldry, first of all, that is connected to this funeral. The heraldry was at the time an important way to demonstrate lineage, demonstrate the unity of marriage, and demonstrate the heritage of a royal family. So for Catherine, the main coats of arms that were featured on banner rolls and coats of arms in the funeral was Castile, Aragon, Granada, Prince Arthur, and we also have one reference to Lancaster. So that's kind of going all the way back to John of Gaunt and John of Gaunt's links to the Iberian Peninsula. And what's significant about these is there's missing from it. There is Henry VIII's heraldry. So already we're getting this idea and this sense of, no, Henry's not being part of this. You are clearly the wife of Prince Arthur. Now, these banner rolls would have formed part of what I call a tombscape. And it's a really useful phrase that I've heard and I've seen used by a historian called Diane Heath. And I like to use it because a tomb can often just refer to like a single monument, whereas a tombscape includes the monument, but includes the location and what's all around it. And I think that that's really important because these banners, although they're not directly on the tomb, they are surrounding it. So they're still playing a part in creating Catherine's memory. So these banners are still saying, look at her status and her heritage as a princess of Spain, but clearly defining her as the wife of Arthur and Arthur only. Henry is staying well clear at that. So I think that's why it's important to look beyond a physical monument of a tomb and look at what's around it. In terms of what we think was on the tomb, there's some sources, but they're not clear. We get a reference to like a high altar style black marble box. And I found there is a letter that I found at the Peterborough Cathedral archives that it draws almost like a checkerboard box, cuboid altar with the coat of Katherine of Aragon on the front. There's no context behind this. So it could be that this is a later guess as to what the tomb looked like, or it could just be that this was taken from a manuscript that is now lost, but it's not entirely clear. But what I find really interesting as well about just the funeral being so lavish, you would think, okay, well, we've talked a lot about being isolated and trying to remove Catherine from court. But actually having a lavish funeral was Henry's way of almost doing the bare minimum in terms of Catherine's memory. So by giving her this grand funeral, he's accepting and honouring Catherine's status as a member of the royal family, but he's clearly defining that status as a dowager princess. So because of this, we can then interpret and infer, that there probably was quite a big tomb. It probably wouldn't have been unmarked. There would have been something. So I find the stories and the rumours of this kind of slab marble altar type piece quite believable.
That's so interesting. Can I just ask you just to clarify when you're talking about banners, is that in the fabric of the church, or are we talking textiles, or is this inscribed into something? Do we have any sort of information about that?
Yes, so think about, I like to think of them as kind of like large like standards that are kind of held and put up around the coffins. So they could be put into the actual fabric of the church using like kind of poles, or they could be draped over kind of like heraldry that comes from the ceiling. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And so our listeners probably already picked up the fact that I said what was the original tomb like. So, of course, there have been changes over the centuries. So can you tell us about the times that this particular tomb has been disturbed? And do we know why it was disturbed?
Yes. So the big time that Catherine's tomb was disturbed was during the Civil War. The Civil War saw lots of iconoclasm and vandalism across the country, and Peterborough did suffer severe damage, and you can still actually go and see some of the damage that has been preserved today. Cambridgeshire was the home county of Oliver Cromwell, so Peterborough, being in Cambridgeshire, was very close. And the parliamentarians were kind of using Peterborough as a base to make an attack on Croydon Castle. Now, whilst they were there, they seem to have just had this idea of, okay, yeah, let's just go a bit lax on the rules, shall we say. So there had been some fighting, but what we get from a gentleman called Simon Gunton is a fabulous account 40 years after about what the parliamentarians did with this kind of loose directorship and loose generalship. So Simon Gunton was the vicar of Peterborough Cathedral at the time during the Civil War. So he's a first-hand source, and he would have known and seen what damage had been done. So the description that Gunton gives were that soldiers were allowed to execute their fury upon the cathedral, destroying all things as the malicious eye of each sectarian varlet prompted him to do mischief. This included stuff like smashing windows, defacing and tearing off brasses, destroying gravestones, and also destroying monuments. So Catherine's tomb at that time would have been one of the most prominent monuments in that cathedral. And we've got no evidence that says the orders were specifically to target Catherine's tomb. It just seems to be a complete free-for-all with these soldiers. It seems to be complete chaos. So I don't think Catherine's tomb was targeted, but I think the result of this free-for-all was almost a total destruction of Catherine's tomb. And this is, again, repeated and acknowledged in several other sources by somebody called like Dean Patrick and later Victorian antiquarians. All of them just say complete destruction of it. It's so sad and frustrating because it does seem to just be blind vandalism instead of a targeted account. Now, interestingly, there was an act passed by Parliament which said that royal and noble tombs were to be left unscathed. But this does not seem to have been followed by anybody. So it seems like in the field, again, it's just this idea of being hyped up, having lack of leadership, and just having a sense of total chaos and feeling like they can do whatever they want and destroying buildings and monuments as they go through. I find it so sad. But I think because of the lack of directed orders to destroy Catherine's tomb, I don't think that we can say that it was definitely a targeted move against Catherine. I think it might have had some kind of symbolic act when they were doing it, but I don't think it had this kind of wider, we're going to go and destroy all of the royal tombs, because actually when you think of places like Westminster, most of the tombs were preserved, and they're the tombs of monarchs and kings, and perhaps would have been seen as more influential than Catherine at the time. So you would have presumed that they would have been destroyed. After the Civil War, there's one other recording of Catherine's tomb being exhumed, but it seems to have been when they were, as always, in my research, what I'm finding is Victorians like to redo floors. And while they're redoing floors, they find tombs. It happens with Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Howard. It happens with Katherine of Aragon as well. But they quickly, they find her coffin and they quickly rebury it, so they don't disturb her tomb or her actual coffin.
We obviously know the damage during the Civil War period, but is there definite evidence that her tomb disappeared at that point? Or maybe this is a good time to tell our listeners what we actually have left, and then maybe we can work back and you can tell us a little bit about when you think that sort of became what it is today.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the tombscape that's there today, in the pillars, there is some evidence of something being attached to those pillars. Now, as far as I have researched, nothing else has been in that space. So that makes me think that the kind of sections cut out of the pillars must have had something to do with Catherine's tombscape in some sense. There's also at the bottom, there's again some like kind of engravings, some holes which look like things had been attached to it. What we see basically after the Civil War is we just see Catherine's tomb referred to as kind of a plain, simple slab marble in the floor, grey slab marble. In the late 1700s, there's a reverend, a priest, who pays for new brass inlay for Catherine. But again, it's described as very simple. So until we get to the late 1800s, we see a dramatic change from the kind of this altar style tomb that is described in the 16th century to what is essentially just a slab in the floor with a very simple brass monument. So I think that kind of shows the complete destruction. And we haven't got any of the textiles or anything like any funerary achievements, anything like that. They've all disappeared. So I think it really was almost like a total destruction. And that kind of goes with the destruction that happened around the cathedral as well. It was quite intense.
Yeah, so as far as we know and as far as your research shows, the current spot where we find Catherine's monument today is where we think the tomb that you spoke about earlier, that kind of chest, you think it was in that position as well?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. I've had no evidence to say that it's moved otherwise.
So let's talk a little bit about how people have actually interacted with this tombscape or tomb or monument over the years, and how has Catherine's memory, I suppose, been promoted?
Yes, so the really big change starts in the late 19th century. You get the new slab. So if you go to Peterborough Cathedral today, you will see a black marble slab on the floor. That and the grate that is behind the iron grating is part of this late 19th century redesign of the tomb. Now, legend has it that this was prompted by a letter from a young girl to the deans of Peterborough Cathedral. And she was saying about how horrible and awful it was that Catherine's memory wasn't being honoured, and that if all the Catherines of England were to put in some money to raise funds, they could build a new tomb. Now, this kind of idea of a fundraiser was taken on by Catherine Clayton, who was the wife of one of the deans of Peterborough as well. So there was definitely a fundraiser. And there was a letter. We have evidence that there was a letter written by a young girl, and we find this in newspaper reports at the time. However, as lovely as that story is, I don't think it's the main reason behind why they decided to do a redesign of Catherine's tomb. I think it's got a lot more to do with the fact that at the time they wanted to promote Peterborough as a city. There's lots of references in the newspapers to wanting to promote and compare Peterborough to places like Leicester and to promote civic pride and in having a historically important national monument. Also, I think we need to be realistic and think a letter from a young girl and a fundraiser isn't always necessarily going to be enough to change something. And I think there is, in the Peterborough Standard, you get a response to this little girl's letter, and you have somebody called Dr. Perrone who calls this a pretty suggestion. And he basically says that basically the Catherines of England would do well to use this opportunity of strowing with maiden flowers the grave of the good queen instead of promoting and trying to raise money to do a new tomb. He says that Catherine was not the most interesting of the queens of England as well. I definitely think that on their kind of committee side and from the deans of Peterborough Cathedral, there wasn't really very much impetus to give her a new tomb. But when you see people talking about like the town pride, they talk about stuff like a small voice from the distant continent almost put to blush Peterborough, so privileged in possessing such a national and historic monument as our cathedral. And the neighbouring diocesan towns of Northampton and Leicester are likely to throw our poor city into the shade of its inhabitants. Do not arouse themselves thoroughly and take their share of this arduous task in which the dean and chapter have engaged with. Again, I think that although it's lovely to have this idea of this fundraiser and it's kind of romanticized, I think what it was they kind of saw that they needed to promote the town. And a really good way of doing this was to promote the fact that they have a Queen of England buried there. So Yeah, sorry to those who really want to.
I love
Really
that
love
story.
I feel really sorry because it is a lovely story, and there
It
was a
is.
fundraiser.
Yeah, I'm glad that there was a fundraiser. I was worried there you were going to say it didn't exist. I thought, oh no. But I am glad that there was some sort of fundraising, even if the motivation was completely different to that lovely story.
Yes, yeah. Another reason could have been, and it's linked to kind of this idea of civic pride and tourism, and it could have been that there's a myth that has perpetuated throughout the centuries that Katherine of Aragon saved Peterborough Cathedral. So because Katherine of Aragon was buried in Peterborough Cathedral, that stopped Henry from dissolving the monastery and actually caused it to be turned into a cathedral. Now, this is something that is told by tour guides and is again repeated, but I found no evidence for this. In fact, I've just found evidence for the contrary, that if anything, it was the deans of the abbey and the abbots of the abbey at the time. They seem to have been paying Thomas Cromwell a pension.
Interesting.
I think this might have been a small bribe, and hence why it survived. So, but I mean, if people in the 19th century truly believed in this myth, then again, restoring Catherine's tomb is a way of kind of restoring and highlighting the pride in such an amazing cathedral that they had then. What I really like about Catherine's new monument is the blending of iconography and words, because the ability to read icons has over time become less and less for people. So in the 16th centuries, it would have been natural to have seen an image or an icon and to understood its meaning. Getting into the 19th and 20th century, and certainly today, that's less and less common. What you see on Catherine's marble slab is a combination of the two. So you've got pomegranates that run all the way down the centre, and pomegranates being the symbol of Katherine of Aragon when she was queen. They refer back to the idea of Catherine's heritage. So they were actually the symbol of the city of Granada. And the taking of the city of Granada was a really important conquest for her mother and father, Isabella and Ferdinand. It kind of shows the strength of Spanish unity and the strength of Spain as a country. So the pomegranate not only refers back to Catherine's heritage, but it also promotes her queenship because it was often displayed next to the Tudor rose. Now, although we don't have any Tudor roses at all on this 19th century tomb slab, I think that the pomegranate alone does enough to symbolize herself as a queen, because we're so used to have seeing it with accompanied by a Tudor rose. But also now we just think, Catherine, the pomegranate, that's Katherine of Aragon. She was a queen. So I think it's kind of taken on a new power and a new symbolism. But what they've done is around the tomb, the epitaph clearly states that she was the wife of Henry and clearly calls her a queen. So going all the way back to the beginning, when we have this conflict of what her status was from the 19th century, it's very clear that they are defining her as a Queen of England. Now, this, again, cynically, could be viewed as a kind of promotion, tourist promotion kind of attempt to encourage visitors in by saying we have a Queen of England buried there. But also, if you look at a lot of queenly biographies in the 19th century, the number just explodes. There's so many of them out there, and people are interested in Catherine. They're interested in her story. And I think what's significant about Catherine is this idea of romanticizing. So a lot of historians and a lot of people who study memory and what memory is and does talk about this idea that every generation will remember and reinterpret in a different way. And I think I use Estelle Parank's one of her articles, which really nicely talks about this reinterpretation, marrying this up with the idea of romanticism, marrying it up with the idea that authors like Agnes Strickland and Mary Hayes were promoting Victorian domestic values as well in their work. It was a very targeted bourgeois attitude that was being written within these texts. Somebody like Katherine of Aragon, who was a wronged queen, but who was a model wife, a pious woman, a model mother, she kind of enveloped and invalued Victorian ideals. So it's something that people of the time could understand, relate to, and therefore promote. So I think that's, again, another reason why we see this kind of new tomb coming up and this emphasis of her status as a queen, because they believe they are righting a historical wrong and having this justice righted in their time. Moving on from the kind of the 19th century redesigns, we get two more periods of when Catherine's tomb was, I don't want to say played around with, I want to say explored and developed, I think are the better words to say. So the first one is in the 1930s, where you get two banners, which you can still see today. You get two large banners presented to the tombscape, one by Queen Mary of Teck, and that is the English or British Royal Coats of Arms. And the other one was the Arms of Castile, and that was donated by a member of the Peterborough Museum Society. So again, you've got Catherine's heritage being displayed on this new tombscape, but you've also got this this affirmation that she is queen. She's got the royal coat of arms, which was denied to her with the original heraldry and banners that were displayed during her funeral. Now, the second piece of work that we see is in the 1980s. I'm not quite sure from the research what exactly came out of these talks. So I've got minutes from Lambeth Palace, which there's loads of ideas floating around about how they can celebrate the 450th anniversary of Catherine's death. And they've got ideas of having like a £600 budget, what they can do, because the tomb they saw was easily overlooked. And this idea of it being easily overlooked is also mentioned in 1930 when the banners are presented. So personally, I think this idea of it being easily overlooked, people don't think it's grand enough for a queen. And I think that's a very modern idea. I think we look at the tombs, say, in Westminster Abbey, and we think that's a royal tomb, whereas a slab in the floor we don't necessarily see as being royal or grand enough. So I think, again, there's this idea of wanting to promote her as a queen and also to make it more obvious that she is a queen for tourism reasons. But there's lots of different ideas that floated around in the 1980s. One of them includes this kind of gold lettering. Now, again, no direct evidence, but I think this gold lettering is the one that you see on the tomb, iron grille behind the tomb today. It's not mentioned in the 19th century records, but it is mentioned there. And it's quite modern looking, I feel, when you look at it. They also talk about moving different statues around or doing an exhibition on her. So I think as we kind of move into the modern day, and definitely since the 1980s and 1990s, when queenship studies have really taken off as an area of historiography, I think what her tombscape does today is not only promote her memory, but it encourages people to look in and research her life further. So we got that when I first went to Peterborough Cathedral, there was a whole exhibition on Katherine of Aragon in a kind of little education building, and they've still got a small biography about her on her tomb, and she's promoted on the Peterborough Cathedral website. You know, she's got a whole page dedicated to her. In terms of Peterborough Cathedral, they're really marketing Katherine of Aragon, but they want people to, and when you think, why are people going to come? It's because they want to know more about her, because she is an interesting figure, and because there is more literature on her now than there ever has been before. And I think the ultimate show of how important Catherine's tomb is to this day is the Katherine of Aragon festival that happens in Peterborough at the end of January. It happens in Peterborough because that is where she's buried. It could happen in several different locations. You know, it could happen in Spain. It could happen in places in London. But no, it happens in Peterborough. It happens by her. It's almost like there's this kind of connection. And that festival has so many great new papers discussing elements of Catherine's life, which have been previously untalked about, and kind of furthering and challenging notions of her life. So I think, if anything, the tombscape is still promoting her memory, but promoting us to question and really explore and engage with her life, possibly more than the kind of the memorial aspect of the 16th century tomb would have done.
Yeah, I have to say, I find Catherine's, I'm going to use your word now, tombscape, very moving. And I spent quite a lot of time there when I was there. And it is incredible, really, to be standing near the mortal remains of someone, especially as extraordinary as Katherine of Aragon. So I encourage anyone that can get to Peterborough to please go and visit. And yes, you mentioned the festival. I've never been because I don't usually go to England in January for obvious reasons. But I really would love to do that one year. Absolutely. So I feel like, Charlotte, that you've probably answered this question. Am I right in thinking then that you feel that contemporary values do influence the way in which the site of a tomb is used, or in which the way people like Katherine of Aragon's memory is promoted?
Definitely. I think you can see that from the very beginning to the modern day. the way that the tomb is set up, the way that it's designed, where it's placed, those initial construction of the tombscape. For Catherine, it had a reason, it had a purpose, and the purpose was essentially for the Henrician government to emphasize her downgraded status as a dowager princess. It was also to try and isolate her a little bit, remove her from London, stop her being a kind of a rallying cause against the Henrician machine. So that was kind of her first tombscape. The Victorian one, when we look at what was being written about queens at the time and how the tomb was used and why it was possibly given the go-ahead, the 19th century tomb makes a lot more sense. So we can see why it was not only done, but why she was promoted as a queen at the time. Again, seeing as this tragic heroine figure that needed to have this kind of wrong righted. And I think that this is kind of continued over time. And it's something that I've been able to, when researching other tombs within my thesis, I've been able to highlight is that contemporary societies, especially if they're redesigning a tomb, will always redesign it with values that they want to promote within that person. And I think that's what makes these tombscapes really exciting, because most people would think, okay, especially in places like Westminster Abbey, you have a tomb and that's it, it's frozen in time. Whereas actually, if you look at the ones that are outside of London, and particularly tombscapes that are on their own. So like Catherine's is on her own now. She had Mary, Queen of Scots, buried there, but Mary was moved under James I to Westminster Abbey. I think actually the irony of the isolation in the 16th century has now become the strength, because it's allowed the tombscape to develop. It's allowed it to be a living, breathing monument that continues to change, and that has actually resulted in the creation of and the appreciation of this woman's memory in the 21st century, and actually furthering our understanding and appreciation of what her life was and what she did. So I think the key takeaway is that, yes, contemporary values definitely did and always will do influence the way that we interact with these tombscapes, because of the nature of memory. But I do feel that these tombscapes are living, breathing things, and they're continually altering and changing. So even if you don't think that the actual physical tomb changes, what happens around it is we've still got to take that into respect, because it's still building upon it. It's ultimately the tomb is the nucleus of the tombscape, and everything else that goes on around it is building up this memory, building up this perception of this woman and celebrating their life.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating way to think about it. And I think you've given us so much food for thought and things to reflect on, but I can't let you go just yet, Charlotte. When I first have guests on Talking Tudors, I like to do a little thing called 10 to go at the end. So these are just 10 very quick questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, what is the last book that you read, or one perhaps that you're currently reading?
Or I've just finished the last book that I read, and it was City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. And it was a book my friend told me to read at secondary school, and I've only just got around to reading it. But yes, so I've just finished that, and I'm about to start Sisters of the Rising Sun by Heather Morris. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Lovely. That sounds great. And maybe apart from Peterborough, let's leave Peterborough out of it, what's a historic site that you really like to visit?
I adore Westminster Abbey. I just love the building. It's my favourite building in the whole of the UK. I think it's just so stunningly designed. I love the atmosphere in there, that ability to be close to, for me, all these famous people. But again, I kind of like this idea of just kind of having a few minutes to remember them and what they did. Most people kind of charge on past because they're part a funnel, but I kind of like stopping and just taking that moment to just remember them, because that's ultimately why their teams were there. And for me, it's like they're in there. This is the closest I'm going to get to these people who I admire or I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, of course, that you're writing a PhD at the moment. So do you have any kind of rituals that you follow when you're in research writing mode?
I like talking to my husband. I know that sounds a bit strange, but I like vocalizing my kind of thoughts. So I might sound a little mad if I'm talking to myself, but it really does help me to kind of formalize and kind of put together my thoughts. And I love doing bullet pointed lists, and it can look a bit confusing, but I love trying to put stuff in order. So then I've got a clear plan and a clear path of what I need to write.
Well, that sounds very organized. I like that. And what about an ideal Sunday morning? What does that kind of look like for you?
Oh, I would say definitely. I would love a slow get up, definitely a lazy morning with breakfast, perhaps a little bit of reading. I don't often get them. My little boy's probably up by then. All we need to do the shopping, but I would say just taking it slow. Taking it slow. I mean, at the minute, I'm doing drama rehearsals on a Sunday morning as well, so I can't do it at the moment.
Oh, that sounds good. Drama rehearsal sounds fun. So if you're looking to, if perhaps you're not feeling very inspired to write or to research, what do you sort of do to kind of boost that inspiration in you?
I kind of just go back to where it started. So I just think, right, okay, well, let's listen to a podcast or watch a documentary, have a look at some photographs as well. So sometimes when I was like struggling to write the section about like the redesigned Katherine of Aragon tomb, just looking at the photographs, it can sound really boring, but sometimes just looking at something for a long amount of time can give you that little bit of inspiration. Likewise, watching documentaries or podcasts, they're always going to throw up something that you go, oh, I didn't know that. And that can kind of lead you down a bit of a rabbit hole into something else. So yeah, just kind of taking a few steps back to take a few steps forward is often quite a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about a series, might be a series or a film that you've watched more than once?
Oh, I'm going to say it. I really like the film Bill. It's done by a group that did the first 5 series of Horrible Histories. And they're also the team that wrote and starred in Ghosts. And I absolutely adore that film. It's basically a kind of retelling of Shakespeare's early career. But I find it so funny. I am constantly seeing new jokes in the film, and I don't know how many times I've watched it. And I reference it so much. It's almost become part of my everyday language, especially when I hear Philip II of Spain, and I'm just like, very good.
That's not actually one I've watched, so I think I'll have to add it to my list too. It sounds really fun.
If you like Monty Python, that kind of stuff,
you're
going to love it.
Oh, I'll have to check it out, definitely. And what about a travel destination, perhaps one that you'd like to visit that you haven't been to?
I am outside of the Tudors and royal history. I am a huge Disney nerd, and I love looking at the history of Disney. So for me, somewhere like Walt Disney World, or even better, a combination of Disneyland and the Walt Disney Archives would be a dream come true. I watch all the archival programs on Disney Plus and go, oh my goodness, they've got that. I was so excited to see the Disney 100 exhibition in London. And I think Disneyland as a place is so special because that's Walt's park. That's the one that he was in. So I think, again, there's that special connection between place, person, the present day.
And then, lucky last question, what do you like to do to relax and unwind a little after all this work that you do?
There's 2 things. I love to bake, and it's actually my husband's birthday today. So I will be
happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Yes. So I'll be baking him his birthday cake after this, but I love baking of all kinds, and I'd love to go on the Bake Off one day, amongst my many other things. But I'm a proud member of the Ilkeston Studio Players. So we're a drama group. We do musical theatre, and they are just such the most supportive, funny, amazing group. And they've really helped to pull out my confidence. So I loved singing anyway, and I would sing all around the house. I often joked that like my next door neighbours are getting a production of Evita this afternoon. But I like going to and actually being able to sing and just have fun has just increased my confidence so much. And I always say, even if I'm in a bad mood at home, I've come home and it's been a bad day at work, I can go to drama and I can come home and just go, I've forgotten what I was angry about because, somebody's done something funny at drama, and now we're doing silly moves like the jazz neck and the jazz hips and the broken doll walk. So, and that's what stays in your mind. So I really encourage, if you can find a group like that, it's so good for your mental health. And I also think that just singing in general is really good for your mental health. Just that ability to just sing really powerfully, even if you can't sing, just go for it. Go for the end of Wicked, because you'll just feel like you've gotten some stress out. That's how I feel. But yeah,
I love that.
Favorite is Phantom, but I have to say my favorite is Phantom of the Opera. I absolutely adore it. Yeah, and I think it's something that, again, coming back to music, it really does kind of relax, winds you down, allows you to release tension.
Yeah, music is so powerful, so powerful. So very last thing is the Tudor takeaway. So I ask all my guests for a takeaway, so something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have one final takeaway for us?
Oh, I do. And seeing as we've talked about it so much, I think I have to promote going to see Catherine's tomb at Peterborough Cathedral. I think Peterborough is an absolutely beautiful city as it is. I really enjoy going there. It's got a fantastic little museum, but the cathedral itself is absolutely gorgeous. You can pay tribute to Catherine herself. You can walk around. Please speak to the fabulous guides that they have been so helpful when I've gone. I've probably taken up more of their time than I should have, but they've been so happy and helpful to point out stuff like the destruction that happened during the Civil War. They're so knowledgeable. So if you can, definitely get to Peterborough, have a day out there, because I can guarantee it's a really lovely city. And just you've got to say hi to Catherine.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with your takeaway. And Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time to talk Tudors with us. I look forward to following your research, and maybe I can lure you back to talk about one of the other queens later on.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely to be on. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.